I did what many around me at the time thought was me selling my soul, and I went to IBM.
What first attracted you to design in the first place?
It was probably my high school art teacher. I've been just drawn to creativity and art.
So what was the original plan going into school?
Initially, the goal was to be an artist.
At some point, you moved from graphic design into UX design. How did that transition happen?
I went into IBM with such a surface level view of what design was at the time, which ultimately made me just a better designer. I also think empathy is so incredibly important in the organizational culture, creating a safe space where people can express themselves. This is a moment in time. It doesn't define who you are for the rest of your career.
What happens when you leave the comfort of a small design studio for the vast corporate world of IBM? For Scott, that bold move had people saying that he sold his soul, but the reality was far more transformative. Scott's journey from boutique design to leading global teams at IBM is a story of creative evolution, leadership growth, and navigating some of the toughest decisions a designer can face. From designing for gold mines to tackling digital transformation in retail and finance, Scott's seen it all. In this episode, we talk about how he made the leap, why empathy is at the heart of his leadership style, and how taking risks has shaped his extraordinary career. Whether you're a designer just starting out or a seasoned pro looking for inspiration, Scott's story has something for everyone. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode packed with insights and stories from incredible guests like Scott. Let's jump in. What first attracted you to design in the first place?
So it was probably my high school art teacher. I've been just throughout my life, I was drawn to creativity and art and drawing, painting, making things. And my high school art teacher said, it's great that you have the passion you do, but if you really want to earn a solid living, you should pursue something in the world of design. And initially I said, thanks, but no thanks. Fast forward to me being in college, and another design professor of the design program came up to me and essentially said the same thing. So I made the shift, but kind of made a promise of myself that I would always, be an artist in the background. And if that was something that I could do full time, then so be it. But also bring aspects of creativity into design so it would still be something that was special to me.
So what was the original plan going into school? Did you study like fine art, or what was the goal?
Yeah, initially the goal was to be an artist. I thought that I might find something in the world of design to do, but I wasn't really sure. So I just, started in foundation classes and stuff like that, and really wanted to pursue painting and started to pursue that. But I also, I had such amazing professors in college, and I started falling in love with photography and sculpture. And so I was trying to decide between all of those, and then had this rather meaningful conversation with a design professor. And that ultimately is what, shifted me in the design direction.
Interesting. What field of design? Was it graphic design or something different?
Yeah, it was graphic design. And in a time that I was in the program was still trying to figure out what to do with technology. And so I had friends in the School of Telecommunications. And so through there, I had access to lots of different types of technology that I would bring into my artwork as well. And so I tried to kind of combine those two, or the multiple mediums, in that way.
Oh, interesting. Was there anything about technology that drew you? Because if you're coming from drawing and painting, you weren't necessarily surrounded by technology as you're going through that. And so it sounds like that came later while you were in college.
Yeah, for me, it was a tool just like any other tool that you would use in artwork. And I found different means of expression in that. For example, I started, experimenting with large scale projections, or also title sequences and things like that, which was this convergence of some technology, but a lot of the design principles and practices as well. And so it was really just through experimentation. But at the time, I saw it all as just new means of expression for me, which was really exciting at the time.
So partway through school, you move from a focus on painting to a focus on graphic design. Was there anything else other than like I guess the commercial viability of that direction that attracted you?
Yeah, it was for me, it was less about the commercial viability of it, even though that's what some of the conversations were about in terms of pushing me that way. But I saw it as such a meaningful practice, such a meaningful profession where you really could combine aspects of the arts into design to reach people and communicate with them. I saw it more as such a meaningful form of communication than anything.
And at some point you move from graphic design into something that looks a little bit closer to like what we all do today in UX design. How did that transition happen? What was your first role outside of school going into design? Was it tech related?
No, so I think it was the summer of my junior year, I think. I just got my own portfolio together and I thought, I want to get my work out. And, at the time it was a mix of a CD-ROM and a web-based experience. But I primarily spent that summer in Atlanta just interviewing with other design firms and meeting other designers and all of that. And it was there that I really kind of converged, the technical aspects that I was playing with and experimenting with design, and started at a small design boutique in Atlanta as a designer, designing everything from, posters to packaging to digital experiences. And then shortly thereafter, I did what many around me at the time thought was me selling my soul, and I went to IBM, which turned out to be one of the best things I did in my career, just because I went into IBM with I think, a surface level view of what design was at the time, primarily just the visual realm. And through those that I was surrounded by, deep experts in interaction design and user research and content strategy, early on in my career, I gained a lot of hands-on experience in those disciplines as well, which ultimately made me just a better designer because of it. So that was a key moment in my career for sure.
Tell me more about that point. So, because those are just such different environments to operate in. So you're going from a small boutique agency to a place like IBM. The people around you think you're crazy. What was the motivation, or how did that even come up?
So, well, a couple things happened. One was I had a friend of mine went from the boutique I was working at to IBM and encouraged me to interview for a role. And things really changed for me. I saw the potential in what that environment could be at IBM through the executive creative director that was there at the time, who I ended up reporting to. And, obviously had great conversations during the interview process. And then once I engaged there and started my career there, she was someone that just had so much more confidence in me than I did at the time. And she would put me in scenarios that I was really unqualified to be in. But what she knew about me was that my work ethic was high and I was a very curious person. I love to learn. And so through that, it taught me kind of to have that sink or swim mentality. When you feel as though failure isn't an option, you find a way to make things work. And she was amazing. I hope to be half the leader today that she was then, but I learned so much through that. And she was always there to, help when I needed it, but also gave me a lot of autonomy to just run and learn and, connect the dots myself. So it was through that experience that she paid for me and that she and I made together that I saw the potential in what a career inside a company like that could be. And the final point I'll make on that is I've always been so passionate about design at scale, similar to your question around, why graphic design? It's that, I think it's so meaningful to be in a profession where any of our processes and methods that we use and know how to do can be applied to anywhere in the world where a human being is using a piece of technology or needs something. And so I saw so much potential in that. And at a company like IBM or some of the other companies I've been with, to have the reach that you do there is really compelling for me.
It's interesting you mentioned that she had like this confidence in your ability and your skill in a way that maybe you didn't even quite have yet. I mean, did you join as an art director? Was that like your first role there?
It was initially designer, and then I wasn't there very long, maybe, I don't know, 6 months, and transitioned into art director.
I mean, because this is still relatively early in your career. And so to be able to move into a role like that at a company like IBM, it's a big deal. Do you think a lot of that came from your previous experience at an agency, or was there something else?
I think it was both the experience at the agency and also, something that I learned early on in my career, probably around that point in time, is just the value of forming relationships, knowing how to make friends, with people that act and think and talk differently than you do. And I think and the company saw potential in that. And I think that's probably what, I started advancing quickly early in my career. I think that's one of the reasons.
What was design like at IBM at the time?
That's a great question. So they were IBM was in the midst of launching what they referred to at the time as innovation centers, which was essentially a new way of thinking and making, which was user-centered design that we know it today. But that was a very different way of working for them at the time in certain parts of the company, where it was very engineering led. And the realm of user experience in such a heavy engineering environment wasn't fully understood. But that studio that I was a part of within the company was really championing what it meant to design for users versus for the needs of technology.
So that approach, which at the time was sort of novel to bring that into like a tech organization, a company that builds software. Do you feel like being a part of that at IBM, like did that sort of shape your approach to how you did design in future roles, or like what part did that play in your like leadership ideas and ideas about how design should happen?
Yeah, I mean, it was important. I saw it at different points in my career, and it looked different than it did then for a variety of reasons. But it was foundational to me saying, okay, design leadership is something that I wanted to be at some point, right? I wasn't yet because I was so early in my career, but because of what design was becoming then at IBM, and because of the other amazing leaders that were there at the time, it really set my trajectory in my career. And at least I knew that there was a path there in some way, shape, or form that I wanted to follow.
Were Was being a manager also part of your role at IBM, or did that come later in your career?
For the project, it was, I had a handful of resources that I was managing as a part of that project that
Mm.
I was assigned to, which I should probably share the cliff notes of too. But leading an organization is something that came later. The primary projects that I was on, it was for an automotive manufacturer based in France. And so I was one of a handful of people from IBM US to represent IBM US to IBM France. And so that was really the focus of my time at IBM, was specific to that project.
I think even if you're only managing a handful of people, there's a lot of differences between that and managing large organizations like you have in your past. But even just making that shift can be really important because being a designer and the craft design, like being a manager is like a totally different job. What was how much of a shift was that for you? Or because of like how the team worked and maybe like the relationship that you had with the people that you're responsible for, was that more of a gradual transition for you into like management roles?
No, it was difficult. It was very difficult. And it made me question what in the world I was doing, because I always envisioned myself as a designer and designing. And yes, there were these other amazing leaders and all, but I found myself at the time doing things that I just didn't want to do, that I didn't enjoy. And working through that and seeing the other side of that, I learned how to be really kind of be my own leader. Like, leadership can look different for everyone. And I started thinking about, well, I don't want to let go of the craft of design. And yet there are aspects of managing a team that I enjoy. I want to get better at those things and also improve on the things that I was really bad at the time. So working through that was really, really key, especially when, over the years, I've had much larger teams than that. And so, there was key milestones in my career where there were absolutely some growing pains for sure.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, you have quite a bit of experience, of course, leading teams and very large teams. What do you feel like, looking back, is the most important skill for a design leader to have to do well in those roles?
Well, I think for one, I think empathy is obviously important as a designer and as a design leader, because an aspect of design leadership is championing product quality, right? And to do that well, you need to have empathy for those that you're designing for. I also think empathy is so incredibly important in the organizational culture that you want, right? Creating a safe space where people can express themselves and people can debate openly, right? And passionately, but in a respectful way too. And also in knowing that, so much of my career has been involved in digital transformations, which quite often can mean a lot of change really fast and very intensely. And not everyone loves that, right? Not everyone loves change. Not everyone loves chaos, right? I enjoy those things to tame it and to shape it, but unless they can see a reflection of themselves in the change, then it's very intimidating. And so having the empathy to know what your teams need down to the individual level, right? Some people in those moments may need more autonomy, right? And others need for you to pull up a chair next to them and just talk and listen or problem solve with you, one-on-one. Where I see empathy being a challenge for younger design leaders is knowing when you have to dial the empathy down a little bit, because sometimes I think empathy can be guided and it may prevent you from having difficult conversations with people, right? Or putting those conversations off too long, moving away from friction versus towards it. Or, the very unfortunate truth of leadership is sometimes we need to transition people out of the company. And those are very difficult conversations to have. And on one hand, you need empathy and compassion to do that well. And at the same time, sometimes we need to dial those things down just a little bit to do what we need to do because it's necessary. That's a rant on empathy in design leadership.
I think it's not often, especially in a design role, that you hear someone talk about the need to have less empathy. And I know there's some nuances to sort of how you're describing it, but I find that really interesting. Certainly, some of the difficult conversations and difficult decisions that you've mentioned, those are tough for anyone, experienced or not. When was the first time, if you remember, that you had to sort of go through that and you had the realization that to make this work, you had to maybe have a little bit less empathy?
Yeah, I want to be clear though, it's not removing empathy. And I'm describing how it works in my brain and heart. For me, it's about turning it down just a bit where, there was a transformation that I was a part of where we had to downsize, and it was early in my time with this company, and we had to let, it was several people go. And, it's that balance, on one hand, you get to know people and sometimes their families well enough, and to sit down and have such unfortunate conversations and make those types of decisions is really difficult. And for me, I remember the moment where it was about, taking the empathy knob and just turning it down. It doesn't mean that there is no empathy or that you're disrespectful in any way. It's just that there's a pace at which things need to happen when when you make those decisions. And so for me, it was maybe a better way of saying it is you need compassion and empathy, but you also need to also respect what needs to be done for the sake of the business. And finding the balance between all of those things is complicated. Everyone does it different, but it is absolutely a part of leadership that you learn over time.
I think one thing that's interesting about the industry right now, and in many ways unfortunate, is you have a lot of people who have been on the receiving end of these types of business decisions. And not all of them have been on the other side of the table where they've had to make those decisions. And so they have that one side of it. And it's really easy to make assumptions that there's a complete lack of empathy for these types of decisions because, they're like very personally affected, particularly for someone who's maybe never been laid off before. What advice do you have for someone who's trying to just like wrap their head around that moment in their career?
Well, so I have been laid off before. So I've also felt the impacts of the other side of it. And that's absolutely informed, my approach during those times. I think, I think it's so important that for designers, it's important to know that typically, right, it's difficult to speak in such general terms about something that incorporates so many different pieces of a puzzle, but so often it's not about you. It's about the state of the economy and the state of the business. And, this is a moment in time. It doesn't define who you are for the rest of your career. It's that there's another side to it. If there's anything to learn from why the circumstances happened when they did, take that and apply it. But, a new opportunity will surface, and, take all the learnings you can from the moment you began a career in design until that point and apply them to the next thing. But yeah, maybe we can also come back to that because I'm sure I'll have better advice later in our conversation.
Maybe to follow up on that, I mean, I think it's great that because you've been through that experience, you're able to develop that empathy for the people that might be affected when you have to make those decisions. But so as a leader and as a manager, that experience has definitely affected how you make decisions. What about as an individual or as an employee? Like when you were laid off, how did that affect how you thought about your role as an employee going forward? And I'm wondering if there's anything maybe for someone that's been through a layoff, like one of the hardest parts is like the surprise and this like shock of the event. And so like, is there something that you did differently to sort of like prepare yourself or maybe even protect yourself the next time around?
That's a great question. I remember earlier in my career when I was laid off, I remember working, like up until that point, I was working with someone that was, we were with the same company. He had been there for 20 years or so. And all of a sudden, he was transitioned out of the company. And between that and my situation happening, within days of each other, I really changed my perspective of what it means to be employed by a company. I think there is this false sense of security, right? You go into, I think especially in the field of design, you think you're going to be, you strive to be the best designer you can possibly be, right? And you use design as with a capital D, right? It can be user research, it can be content strategy, it can be anywhere, anything in between. But I think the assumption is that you be the best designer you can be, and you will be immune from those circumstances, right? And if you move or change jobs to a different company, it will be your decision and not someone else's. And so some of the shifts and changes that I made was that I, I really just, I tried to get more perspective early on in working with a company, in that just realizing that I don't need to work 80 hours a week to, you know, keep my job secure, right? Because there are so many things outside of my control that where it may end without, my doing anyway. So I'm going to make the most of the time that I have, realizing that the people that I'm working with, we probably won't retire together, right? But whether the company changes or we decide on another opportunity, let's make the most of the time that we have, and that doesn't necessarily mean work the most number of hours that you can, but it means be as intentional as you can. It means be kind, like form relationships where people, if you transition away, people want to come with you, or vice versa. It's as much about that as it is just striving to be the best designer you can be in terms of the quality of design. It's about these other spaces too. And so I started putting more emphasis on things like relationships and, areas on the periphery of design, and found that I actually enjoyed my job more. And that's when other leadership opportunities started opening up with the companies that I was with. So
I want to go back to something that you said earlier. And you talked about how having empathy allows you to create like a safe space for people to discuss and share openly. And when you're leading a large team, like it can't be just you. Like that's sort of, an organization wide thing. Like the environment and the culture of that team has to be open for people to feel safe. So how do you create a culture of empathy, or how do you foster empathy in the other people that you have on your team? Because so much of that is like I said, not just you. It has to come from everyone.
yeah, I think there are a couple of things that come to mind. One is the entire organization needs to hear me talk about and voice why it's important, right? And why we want that as an underlying tenet of our organization. In addition to that, I see a lot of value in pulling the teams together, including my leadership team. And as an organization, we workshop and apply design methods to the problem of defining our values, our mission, our vision as a design organization. I find through that, it instills some of these principles that you can't instill. And then also really ensuring that I hold my leadership team accountable and have multiple check-ins on, as a culture, how are we doing, right? Do we know who in our teams is hesitant to speak up? And do we know why? What is the source of that hesitancy? And so doing those things, not once, but periodically over time, can really help shape that.
You just mentioned something about using design methods in some of these activities. And that's interesting because a lot of times, you think about using design methods for screens, or at least, in our field, like we use them to design UI. But you talked about like values and principles, and how does that work? How do you use design for things that maybe are not what we would typically think of things that are designed?
Well, in those types of contexts, the first thing I do is I sit down with each person individually, and regardless of the size of the organization, you know, in my mind, that's where my user research begins, right? On what's broken, what's great that can be greater, where do individuals see that, what's the dream org that they want to be a part of? And what are the blockers to us being that on a daily basis? Things that we use in design, like empathy mapping, doing that in a workshop type of environment is a great way of opening up the conversations to how people feel about the current state. And then we do the same thing for the future state. We look at analogous examples, right? We've all been a part of other organizations, good, bad, and ugly. Let's ensure that we're learning from the past. And, what's an example of an organization that someone has been in where they did something really unique or asked really compelling questions throughout the quarter? Things like that, I think, are a great way of crafting what we want our future to be.
I'm going to combine two different things that you said that may not go together, but you mentioned that a lot of your work has been going through transformation. And I would imagine with empathy being such a core tenet of the way that you work, that part of that transformation is sometimes the level of empathy, maybe coming into an organization with low empathy and raising it over that transformation. Empathy is something that you can measure. Like, how do you quantify an organization with low empathy versus an organization with high empathy?
I don't think you can, in all honesty, like specific to empathy, but where organizations do quantify, similar to CSAT scores for customers, how likely are you to recommend this organization to someone else, right? For NPS, as an example, empathy I think, will always be part of why people see good in the organization. Empathy being just one attribute, but we see it embedded in other ways. And ultimately we have to form assumptions where we don't see a direct line to empathy itself. But no, I think it's there. And maybe there's someone that has measured this specific to empathy. And if so, I would love to learn about that.
Yeah, I mean, certainly you can go too far down the path of trying to measure everything, and empathy is definitely in a category of at least a gray area of, like, maybe it doesn't make sense. But I mean, when you get to the point of, especially in large organizations, like, I think there's this natural tendency to want to measure things. So that can be tough. Something you said earlier about when we were talking about layoffs, and you said you go through these career moments and changes in your career, and you like to believe that they're all going to be your decision. Sometimes they're your decision, but sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're things that you don't control. So as you're going through this, because you've had a long successful career with some great companies, and so from the outside, like, someone would look at that and see that this is, like, consistently up and to the right. Is there like an approach that you feel like you have to kind of, like, maintain some level of control over what direction your career is going, even though maybe in these smaller moments, like, it's not always your choice?
I think for me, it's like, I'm a little more organic than that, like, just in that, if I feel like if I would have tried to plan my career path that too rigidly, I realize that's not what you're implying, but to make the point, if I were to follow that path rigidly, I don't think I would have the exciting opportunities that have surfaced. There are things that I couldn't have planned for, but I think so much of it is, for me, it is about following my instinct. I think over time you hone this voice inside of you where if there's potential in it, if it's something that you should stay away from. I listen to that a lot. And also thinking about, whenever the end of my career is, how do I want these chapters to be written? How do I want them to be defined? And how do I want to show up there? And if it's the opportunities with the company that I can, I'm excited about that chapter as I think about writing it, it's something that I move on to next. But, my desires career-wise are very different now than they were earlier in my career. Right now I'm really driven to, yes, be in a leadership role and also to build something over time, like an extended period of time. But yeah, I guess it's career path for me is a little organic in that way.
What's an example of something like an exciting opportunity that's come up that you feel like you would have missed if you had done too much planning ahead of time?
Well, so one example that comes to mind is when I was independent, working on my own, but I still think it applies. Yeah, I was with a company. I transitioned to be independent, and the second day that I changed my LinkedIn profile to be, independent, just changing my status, I received a call from a CTO who said, I work for, basically, Scott, I need your help. I work for basically a large global mining company, and we make great, haul trucks and dozers and all of that. A haul truck is 3 stories tall, weighs 2.5 million pounds. It's loaded with sensors. What we're really bad at is building the software to remotely monitor that equipment. And so that is an example of something where I never would have guessed that if I branched out on my own, that this opportunity would surface. But I spent 3.5 years inside gold mines in Nevada and iron ore mines in the desert of Western Australia, both conducting user research and building prototypes for how mining superintendents remotely monitor and control autonomous mining equipment. And then that transitioned to building and launching product and design teams globally. But I learned from that, there were so many positive aspects of that experience. I didn't venture out on my own saying, I want mining experience, so I'm going to go work for a mining company. I did what I thought was right at the time with the information I had, and I stepped out with some hope and conviction that would reveal itself, and it was amazing.
Perhaps this is a big reason why, but because of your approach. But I mean, you've worked in like what I would consider pretty diverse fields from, gold mines to, you've also been in retail at Best Buy and Walmart. You've been in finance at H&R Block. So you've sort of collected a perspective from like many different types of companies. And also your time at McKinsey, I imagine, just with the clients that you worked with, like that was pretty diverse. How do you feel like that like range of experiences has shaped how you think about design?
Well, I think I continue to encourage designers to gain experience across multiple industries, because for me, it's really helped me hone my skill set of just solving problems. Because whether you're using design methods or others, solving problems in such complex and diverse environments, it helps me better understand the methods that I evangelize and the methods that I use to apply them in such different environments. The other thing that I've learned is that there's so much more commonality across industries than I think we give it credit for, right? In that, obviously, distinct differences between retail and mining or, finance, name the industry. But at the end of the day, there's a human being trying to solve a problem, and we need to help them do that in the most beautiful and elegant way we possibly can. And so I've learned a lot from that cross-industry experience, but also because it enables you to uncover interests in design that you never knew you had. I never would have even thought about jumping into mining until the opportunity presented itself. But I found that, designing and building experiences in IoT is, man, just so fascinating. And then once I went to Walmart, I saw the relationship between the digital physical convergence, right? Between a 200,000 square foot supercenter or, how to use technology or wearables in a distribution center. All of those are, very relevant to the problems I solved and that we solved in a mining context. So though that's how it shaped me as a designer, and why I continue to encourage designers to gain that type of experience.
Is there something that you have done with your teams to help like foster that kind of experience? Or does that experience happen either before or after they're on your team? Because like once they're on your team, like they're in a specific industry, but do you find that there are ways that you can actually like help people gain cross industry experience while they're on your team?
Yeah, so great question. One of the things that we do is typically in design reviews, a prerequisite for coming to a design review and present is that you look at some analogous examples, right? For example, if we're looking at if we're doing solving a problem with data visualization, we, regardless of the industry we're in right now, solving that problem, we should be looking at what's happening in health and fitness or even automotive, right? And so some of it's about trying to sensitize the way that we view the world, and finding relationships and connections with these disparate industries or, whatever it may be. And then the other is bringing people in from other industries to present their work, right? Just as to have like a design talk or a speaker series can also expose teams to other ways of thinking, other problems to solve. And then the third way is I'm such a fan of having these design assignments that are different from the everyday stuff that we might work on. But if you were Tesla, how would you solve, a problem that the federal government is having, right? Let's spend 90 minutes thinking about that and brainstorming and doing some rapid mock-ups and things like that. So those are some of the light ways of gaining exposure to what's happening across other industries.
I think in our industry, we sort of get into this bubble where we forget that there is a world outside. Everything is we just assume everything works the way that we see it around us. And even sometimes a micro bubble within the specific vertical that we operate in. As you've gone through these exercises and looked at like adjacent or analogous spaces, is there a particular industry that you think is just like maybe not thought of a lot, but you find really inspiring for design that you might recommend people take a look at?
Well, I think, health and fitness and fintech for sure. But, I think those are more, I think what's happening with, healthcare, yes, there's been a resurgence of design thinking and user-centric experiences in healthcare, certainly in the last 5 to 7 years. But I think there's more disruptive experiences there just in the past year or so than I think some people may. So I think there, in mining as well, areas where people don't typically think about innovation necessarily, but I think there's some really interesting things happening.
I think, like you said, I think healthcare is maybe a little bit more out there in the public, or at least a little bit better known what's happening with tech and design. But mining, certainly, at least for me, is not. What's an example of like an innovation happening in mining that, maybe people don't know about but could draw inspiration from?
Well, I think I haven't been in that industry for a couple years now, but many don't know that, an open pit mine runs typically 24/7. And a haul truck, for example, uses LiDAR and other sensors to sense its environment. And so you have this, 3.5 foot or 3.5 story tall machine that's loaded with sensors that senses its environment, communicates with other machines, and can stop on a dime if it senses a person or, something in its path. And so knowing that for those that are in the, digital, physical IoT space, thinking about how that are so hyper aware of their environment, how they function and how they look is something that can bring new thinking to the more everyday problems that are in front of us.
That's interesting. It's really cool. I want to ask you something that I think for some people might be a little bit controversial. You feel like all designers should have some experience in product management at some point. Can you tell me more about that?
Well, to clarify, not all necessarily, but I've seen value in designers that gain product management experience. My experience with it is a while ago in my career, as product management surfaced as a formal discipline, I was seeing that discipline gain more equity and credibility internally, corporately, than design was. And I wanted to know why, right? And so I thought, well, I want I want hands-on experience with product management. And so I teamed up with product management teams and, you know, was a product manager for, in my so many hours per week, right? As I was also designing. But it helped me with a couple things. One is I have as much passion for product management as I do design. And two, I realized that basically the assumptions that I made about design and product management in their proximity to one another was actually true, right? That I see really a hairline, if that, of a difference between product management and design. If you view design with a capital D, we think about a lot of the same things. We just execute in different ways. And so through that, I found, I had great experience. I think it made me a better designer. And I grew from that to where in some leadership roles, I'm accountable for both design and product management, which helps me, yes, elevate design, but also to bring product and design teams together when, what I've seen is sometimes often there can be division between those two teams and some have a difficult time working together. But I think there are ways to bring people together so that we're working in unison, because at the end of the day, we should care about very similar things. So that's why I encourage designers to gain experience in product management.
The overlap in product management and design is really interesting. Like you mentioned, that division between them is a hairline, if that. For someone who's maybe beginning of their career and feels like they could go down either path because they're like maybe most in that intersection that's shared by both. Do you have any advice for how someone might decide whether they're better suited for a role in design or a role in product management?
Well, I think if there's a designer that wants experience in both, I would say hone your craft in design first. And then I think it's about just gaining that experience, gaining that exposure to what a day in the life of a product manager is. If you don't have the time or the ability to take on product manager responsibilities in addition to your designer responsibilities, apply design methods to product managers, right? If, what is it that they're stressed out about? What do they care about? Why are they product managers? And, follow the path of their process to learn more about it. And through that, in the very least, you'll uncover a better understanding of what product managers do and how to collaborate well with them. And you may find that you uncover a passion for the discipline and that you pursue that as a branch.
Where do you think, like as these roles evolve, you mentioned like product management as a formal discipline in this industry is not terribly old. Like you talked about seeing these become more defined roles in companies. Where do you think this is going over the next several years? Like, do you see the role of design and the role of product more heavily overlapping? Do you think they become more distinct? Like,
I see them overlapping more. I really do, because I think, when you think about it, if designers have the proverbial seat at the table, right, that we all want, I think our disciplines need to overlap. And, we need to be, as designers, we need some of the the skills and experience that product management has, and vice versa. And I think we'll see better teams, better product experiences shipped as we overlap these disciplines. That also creates new problems, right? Because at the end of the day, someone needs to be leading, right? Someone needs to be leading the charge. And so then it's, well, do those overlapping organizations and disciplines report into a chief product officer or a chief design officer, or what, I don't know the answers to that yet, but I do see a world where they will be overlapping more versus more distant from one another.
If for product designers, if more and more of sort of the production and basic execution gets automated or handled by AI, and I know you didn't say that, I'm just sort of putting this out there. Do you think that further pushes this convergence of product design and product management?
I think it does to a certain extent because, the tools are getting better, right? There's no doubt about that. Yet I'm not here to say that the tools will replace the people, because I don't think that's the case. And I also think that we all need to be well-versed in the tools that are out there now and the tools that will continue to surface as, those that are leading the charge in the design industry. But I think that the advancement of the tools do play a part in that. For things like design systems, right? I mean, the power that Figma currently has is really impressive. What they've rolled out with this year is really impressive. The reality is it does take design. I think in design, it takes less time to do now than what we were doing a few years ago. But I also think that doesn't necessarily mean that designers need to fill more time with product management responsibilities. I'm not saying that at all. But I think what it does mean is that let's ensure that as designers, yes, we need to be versed in product management, know how product managers work, but also in user research, right? In content strategy, in these other areas surrounding, in front-end development. Being well-versed, not necessarily to fill roles in these other disciplines, but being able to confidently engage in conversation and collaboration across all of these disciplines, I think is so, so important.
This has been an amazing conversation. I'm so glad that we're able to hear your story. What advice would you have for someone who is at the beginning of their career and is maybe aspires to have a type of career that you've had, but they're just in, the first steps?
Well, I think sometimes when I speak with designers who are younger in their career, some are hesitant to take on management responsibilities. And I think one of the things that comes to mind is that, just because you may take that new job or add that responsibility to your plate of management, and you're not really sure if it's going to work out or not, or if you want to do it, I would say go for it, because it doesn't necessarily mean that you're defining the rest of your career by that next decision, right? To say, oh, now you want to be in management versus not. In my career, I've toggled between being inside, client side. I've been on the consultancy side, and I've been independent. For the past few years, up until recently, I was independent. And I feel like through that, I really rediscovered and reconnected with why I became a designer in the first place, because, I was no longer, I had to deliver a design system, and it had been years since I had delivered something like that. Right. But knowing how to shake off the rust and work through that frustration at different parts in your career to sharpen your skills again is something that there's an opportunity for that too. So I would say, when you're young in your career, follow your heart, follow your instinct, ask a lot of questions of the people around you about their thoughts on what you're considering stepping into, and know that no company can control you, right? Like if there's a way out of bad situations, of toxic environments. That's also been something that I've seen over the years is some environments inside companies, not necessarily the enterprise, but in startups as well. It can be toxic and it can be just not for you. You're not held captive, right? You own your career, and you have the insight that you need to make your own decisions.
Cool. Such good advice. And thank you again, Scott, for the conversation. I really enjoyed it.
I did as well. Yeah, this has been a lot of fun.
And that wraps our conversation with Scott. What an incredible journey. From the leap to IBM that sparked controversy to his insights on empathy and leadership, there's just so much to take away from that story. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss out on more inspiring conversations. Thanks for watching. I'm Chris Abad. We'll see you next time on Pixelated Path.